Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. Daniel Blue Tyx, who is a freelance writer from Texas, is writing a book on the individuals and the organizations helping the people, the migrants at the border. His book is called Angry Tias and Guerrilla Lawyers, A Summer of Resistance on the U.S.-Mexico Border. How are you doing tonight, Daniel?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, yeah. No, it's really a pleasure to have you. Ever since I read Ryan Grimm's newsletter in which he was talking about the book that you're writing and Laura Moser is editing, I thought it sounded really interesting, especially since you've been on the ground reporting for so long. So why don't you tell us, first of all, how you started writing about this and what the title of your book means, Angry Tias and Guerrilla Lawyers.
Sure. So I've lived in the border here in McAllen, Texas for 15 years. And I was actually in Mexico this summer when the coverage really started. And I was on a plane on Father's Day with my two kids when all of the rallies were happening. I got back. I had not really been on social media, hadn't been following the news very closely. I, went to the New York Times. I saw that McAllen, Texas was the byline of all the lead stories. And I knew that I had to do something. I was here. This is my home. And this is where I raised my kids. And so right away, I started doing what I could. I went to the bridges. I went to the Ursula Processing Center, which is where most of the migrants were being taken after they were picked up by Border Patrol. And I started to interact with organizations who were doing the work. And I kind of, in the book, the title refers to two groups. One of the groups is an amazing group of women. It's called the Angry Tias and Abuelas of the Rio Grande Valley. And they are ordinary people who felt called to respond to what was happening with family separation. And very early on, the beginning of June, they started organizing. They began working at the bridges. Of course, the Trump administration was denying access to asylum seekers that are making them wait for a week, 2 weeks at a time. These people were camped out on the bridge initially. Eventually, they were pushed over onto the Mexican side. And so they organized caravans of supplies. That was the first stage. Then they started working at the detention centers, visiting moms who had been separated from their kids, who were traumatized, who had no support, and going to talk with them and to tell them, what do you need? What can we do? And also, we're here for you. We're Americans, and we want to be part of the solution, and we support you, and we're going to be here for you. And many of these women have stayed in touch with the moms they met there, through their immigration cases, all the way to now. They exchange text messages, they email back and forth, they call, and these are, amazing stories. So those are the Angry Tias. And then the guerrilla lawyers are lawyers who have really gone above and beyond what anyone could have expected. There's this group called the Texas Civil Rights Project. They're not immigration lawyers, they're civil rights lawyers. They basically stopped everything that they do to their efforts to helping moms and dads get reunited with kids. They went to the courthouse every day, continue to go to the courthouse every single day, taking down the stories of these separated moms and dads and making sure that those are recorded because, of course, as we know now, DHS was not recording that information. Those kids with those to these lawyers showing up in court every day, interviewing the parents for 45 minutes. That was the information that ultimately let most of these parents be reunited with their kids. Those are some of the stories that I wanted to tell in the book.
Now, you told me that you went in with a lawyer because I asked you if you had gone into one of these detention centers, and you said normally they don't let journalists in there, but you went in as an assistant to the attorney and you were able to get some stories. Can you tell us about some of the more interesting ones?
Journalists typically are not given access to the detention centers. Even our Congress people are not given access to the detention centers. I went with a lawyer for a group out of San Antonio. It's called the Migrant Center for Human Rights. And she invited me to come to see what was happening. And so She introduced me as her assistant. Little did I know that I was actually going to be her assistant when I showed up, because what we found when we got there was, in lieu of a consultation room where a lawyer might meet individually with a client, we were actually in a courtroom. At first, I thought we were in court, but we weren't in court. We were in a courtroom where there were 15 asylum seekers who had all come to meet with this lawyer from San Antonio. And she was triaging as best she could. She had a volunteer, a patent lawyer who knew nothing about immigration law. She'd given him a crash course on the way over. There was a summer intern, and then there was me. And she said, Daniel, I know you speak Spanish. I want you to take stories. It will be useful later. And so I started talking with a dad. The dad was in dire straits because he had a 17-year-old. He was from El Salvador. Once that 17-year-old became 18, he would no longer be a minor. They would no longer have any reunification rights. So we worked with him. The second woman that I worked with was a woman named, I call her in the book, Andrea. And I always remember her face. She was young, a teenager. She had pigtails, curly pigtails, and she had just found out that there had been a delay in the processing of her case. She had thought she was going to be reunited with her young daughter. That wasn't going to be the case. She was devastated. She was so traumatized, and it really brought home to me, people like Andrea were having to make decisions that would impact the future of their entire lives, and they were doing so where they were separated from their children, and they were so traumatized that it would have been hard for them regardless, because they didn't know the ins and outs of asylum law, immigration system. But add to that the trauma of family separation, and it was just awful. And then the last story that I really remember from that day was a woman who I've stayed in touch with since through phone calls. Her name was Josefina, and she had an unusual case. She was an adoptive mother. And she had adopted her child, who's now 4, a son, when he was 1 day old. The mother had been addicted to drugs and homeless and had given up the child. She had taken custody, but because she was not the birth mother, of course, DNA tests did not show that she was the birth mother. She had, when she was first processed at the port of entry, she had said that the boy was her son. Considered him her son, but that had created all kinds of legal troubles. And unfortunately, to this day, she is still separated from her 4-year-old son. She's still in custody. She has having health problems. She's having her blood pressure is through the roof. She's lost all of her hair. Yeah, these stories, they stick with you, right? It's been, even as a journalist, removed from everything, it's been a challenge, to deal with hearing them.
Yeah. What was your observation of the conditions when you got inside? Is it as bad as we've been led to believe in some of the pictures that we've seen?
So I was at Pearsall, which is a detention center that serves adults. It's not like the pictures that you might see at the Ursula Processing Center, which is the Border Patrol facility where people are held in cages. The temperatures are unbelievably low. It's terribly uncomfortable. I think, people are fed a decent meal. The conditions are maybe not awful, but it's the trauma of being separated from your children, of not knowing what the future holds, of food that is foreign to you. And so people have health problems. And I think one thing that I really want to emphasize is that a place like Pearsall and most of these for-profit detention centers, they're not in, San Antonio. They're not even in McAllen, where I live. They're in these isolated rural communities. And that has so many effects. One of those effects is that lawyers have a tough time getting there. I mean, we drove for an hour and a half from San Antonio to get to Pearsall. We drove an hour and a half back. And that is, a daily routine for someone who committed their lives to serving these migrants. Another problem is medical care, right? They're not doctors. They're not mental health professionals in these communities. And so either they drive that hour and a half, or they don't come at all.
Now let's talk about why they're located in these rural communities. And this is part of the problem. There's a huge industry right now with private prisons and detention centers because the heartland of the country has been hollowed out by loss of manufacturing jobs. So this is a new industry. And you mentioned that the people are happy to have the jobs, even though they're not happy with what the jobs do, they're happy to have the jobs. What have been some of your observations about the private for-profit nature of these facilities and how that exacerbates the problem, and also the conversations that you have been able to have with people that work there?
So this is a huge problem. One of the first stories that I did as a freelance journalist years ago now was at a private prison facility called Willacy County, which was better known at that time as the tent city. Now we have Tornillo, which has the tents. So this was the same thing for immigrant detainees starting, back in the early 2010s. And there was a riot at this prison, and I was assigned to cover the riot. The prisoners actually, to protest the awful conditions, the lack of medical care in particular, they took lead pipes and they destroyed the facility. And the facility was closed. And there was reporting at that time in the nation and elsewhere about all of the abuses that had led to this from the corporation, which is called MTC. Well, when that happened, this community, Raymondville, lost 1/3 of its revenue overnight. They were dependent on the revenue from the private prison facility to make their budget work. And there are communities like this all over the country that are so reliant on a single employer, a private prison employer, that they have no choice. They feel that they have no choice but to take these jobs. And in fact, I think this example is a very good illustration, because this summer, at the height of the family separation crisis, despite the fact that a riot had destroyed the facility, the prison reopened to house separated parents, operated by the same company that had allowed those conditions to persist, that had precipitated the riot that destroyed it. And so communities are so desperate to see this pattern repeated over and over again. A different issue is the facilities that are housing children, right? And for the most part in Texas, those are nonprofit facilities. But what we're seeing more and more, and some excellent reporting in the New York Times especially, those facilities, although they are technically nonprofit, they are operating like for-profits.
Right. The CEOs are making a lot of money.
Right. I mean, the CEO of Southwest Key made $1.5 million last year on the backs of migrant children.
Right.
And they're also doing this self-dealing, where the owners or the CEO owns the facility, but the charity rents the facility at an exorbitant rate from the owner, right? And then they also own these for-profit companies that do construction and do food services and do maintenance, and they pay them, again, exorbitant rates. And it's really criminal.
I did a show on Sears and the bankrupting of Sears, which didn't have to go bankrupt. It was a profitable store. They made products that people wanted to buy. People were happy working there. And Eddie Lambert, the venture capitalist, we call him a vulture capitalist, basically took over. He got the stores and he owned the land, and then he rented them back to Sears. So he took the rental money, and then he did all this self-dealing and double dealing, exactly like you're talking about. It's just so endemic to our culture right now. Even charter schools, they're nonprofit, most of them, and they do the same self-dealing. So let's talk about the politicians now, because we've seen some politicians famously go down there and, for photo ops. And tell us about some of the ones that you've just seen come down one time, some of the ones that are working there, more often, and some of the ones that have actually effectuated change.
Right. I think initially there was a rush by a number of politicians to come to make a name for themselves, to get on TV. I was really looking at that time, especially in June, for a emerge who would kind of personify opposition to family separation and be an engaged spokesperson for the long term. And I didn't really see that happen at first. Julian Castro came, he led a rally. It seemed like he was going to be coming down often, and then that didn't continue. Beto O'Rourke came once, and Beto has been very involved in El Paso, which makes sense because that's his constituency. But he didn't come back here except for the campaign. I would say that the politicians who we have seen come back in a more sustained way and really make a difference, the first person that comes to mind is Jeff Merkley. He came in early June when very few people were talking about family separation. And he visited the Ursula Processing Center. He was the first person that I used the term dog kennel. In fact, he was given 3 Pinocchios by the Washington Post for saying that kids were being kept in cages, which was true. And he also was turned away at the Casa Padre, the Southwest Key Walmart Supercenter facility in Brownsville. And that really brought awareness. And that awareness was so important because once people knew what was happening, it was not very much more time until the family separation policy was at least officially stopped. And he came back, a couple of weeks later. He brought a whole bunch of Congress people, including our local Congress people. That made a big difference. And he continues to work on this. He came in December and he is now focusing on the conditions, what we were just talking about at some of these, especially detention centers that serve families and children. And we've seen, these children who've been dying either in the facilities or soon after they're released. We're learning more about the lack of mental health care, the lack of just medical care. And he's really been at the forefront.
Jeff Merkley, for people who don't know, is the senator from Oregon. He's the junior senator from Oregon. To my mind, he's the second most progressive senator after Bernie Sanders. He was the only senator to endorse Bernie Sanders in 2016. And he comes from a social service background. He used to be the director of Habitat for Humanity. So like Bernie Sanders, he has a lot of compassion for people who are poor and oppressed and, victimized. So I remember watching that live stream that he did when he was outside calling them up on the phone, and they didn't even let in a senator. And they said they were going to get a manager and call him back, and he's waiting there in real time. We're seeing 15, 20 minutes go by. He calls again, and then he leaves his phone number on the air. Live.
His personal phone number, yes.
And I called the number, and I said, you guys might want to change your number because, and by the way, I want him to come on my show. I met Jeff Merkley. I actually went to 2 fundraisers for him here in Los Angeles and contributed because I think he's great. And he's considering running for president. He's somebody that I would support if Bernie didn't run. Now, let me ask you I asked you about the people that were volunteering and if you were able to detect whether they were liberal or conservative, because sometimes, you have these disasters, you have tsunamis and whatnot, and people get very concerned about the victims, and they don't care about the political party, like Republicans, conservatives can be very generous in times of disaster. Maybe they don't vote for the politicians that are going to prevent the conditions that led to the disaster, but they will always help the victims. So you were talking about the Seventh-day Adventist and the other conservative Christian groups, as well as the gun-toting volunteers. Tell us about some of the volunteers.
So I think this is a really important point, that family separation is an issue that does unite people across party lines, across religious lines. People at a very visceral level have reacted very strongly against family separation, and that includes all kinds of people. So I have a friend who's a Mennonite pastor in San Antonio who has worked as a liaison with evangelical Baptist churches in San Antonio, who have funded a number of efforts, including shelters for refugee families in Mexico, which is becoming a major issue, also have taken in a large number of children as temporary sponsors until they were reunited with their parents. These are very center-right churches, oftentimes mega churches, who have not historically been involved in issues of immigration, the need to do this. Here in the Valley, I mentioned the story of Elisa Filipponi, who's a wonderful woman, a very interesting person. And she was by herself. She was close to the Brownsville bus station. In Brownsville, what we saw was that ICE was just dropping off dozens of people every night right before the bus station closed.
Wow.
So they had no place to go, no place to spend the night. And so the Angry Tias organized, Elisa got involved to provide housing in people's homes, just local community members. And Elisa is a gun-toting Texan, and the bus station is in a sketchy part of Brownsville. So every night, right before closing time, she would strap on her gun. She has a concealed carry license. She'd put it in her holster. She'd walk the few blocks to the bus station, and she would meet the people who were being dropped off there. And she would arrange to make sure that they had some place to stay, especially women, pregnant women, who otherwise would have been in this sketchy area of town with no place to go. So it really has been an issue that has cut across partisan lines. And then Elisa got to know her next door neighbors. They saw her walking every day. Her next door neighbors, as it turned out, were Seventh-day Adventists. And they said, is there anything that we can do to help? And they ended up taking a number of, and still do, taking a number of refugees every night into their church and welcoming them, serving them meals, and then getting them back to the bus station where they'll go to be reunited with their families the next day. And so it has been a community-wide effort here in the Rio Grande Valley to respond. And it has to be because there are so many people. I mean, right now, if I were to walk over to the Humanitarian Respite Center, it's about 2 miles from my house, there would be more than 500 refugees waiting there right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, for those of people who are watching that don't know the genesis of this situation, maybe you can give us the cliff notes about why so many migrants are coming over from these countries at this present time.
Okay, so I think to answer the question, I go all the way back to the 70s and 80s because the genesis really starts with American interventionism in Central America. And that's the great irony of this, is that, in many ways, United States policy has led to the problem that we're now perpetuating. So, in the 70s and 80s, we saw these authoritarian regimes in El Salvador and Guatemala that were supported by the United States. And we were providing them with arms, of course. They were brutally repressive. Civil wars lasted for dozens of years. Hundreds of thousands of people died. By the 2000s, we saw that many of the men who participated in these civil wars were employed. They were becoming involved in organized crime. Organized crime is becoming rampant. And at the same time, in the United States, we have these 3 strikes policies in places like California and then elsewhere. We have mass deportation under Bush and then Clinton. And so who are coming from the United States who have joined gangs like MS-13 and so on in the United States who are being deported into Central America, who are then introducing these gangs to Central America where they were not before. Wow. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, we have continued American malfeasance in Central America. I know we were talking earlier about 2009 when there was a coup in Honduras. And the president at that time was Manuel Zelaya. He was a moderate leftist. People tried to brand him another Hugo Chavez or another Nicolas Maduro, but he really wasn't. Mm-hmm. He was taken by the military in his pajamas out of the country. Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, famously, would not say that it was a coup, which would have required a stronger response from the United States government. It's hard to say what would have happened if the United States had reacted more strongly in support of Zelaya and in support of, in fact, democracy. But certainly what we have seen since then is that Honduras has become the #1 sender of migrants, whereas before, had been relatively stable in comparison to El Salvador. By 2010, the next year, it had the highest murder rate in the world. There was a huge crackdown on activists, environmental activists, LGBTQ activists, human rights activists. Thousands of people were killed, disappeared, and that has persisted up to the present day.
Well, I was telling you earlier that Hillary Clinton, when she came for one of her rare public appearances, usually she just came to LA for high dollar fundraisers.
Mm-hmm.
But when she actually had a public appearance in East LA, she was protested by a lot of Latinx people who were accusing her of, that coup, basically saying she supported the coup, and she's held responsible for the death of activist Berta Cáceres. How has this work affected you? Because I know when people spend a lot of time working on an extended story like this, it changes your life. How would you say this reporting has changed your life?
In some ways, it has been inspiring, to see how people in my community have banded together with very limited resources to effect a change and to welcome people who have nothing and who have the longest obstacles one can imagine to having basic safety and well-being. That being said, it's been hard, to hear these stories over and over again. And I always remember I got a call from one of the people I'd interviewed who was in San Antonio. And he was part of the Interfaith Welcome Coalition that's been active there. And he had worked with the family who had come to a shelter there. And he asked me to come help in McAllen. And so, as a journalist, I don't typically get involved, but I decided, okay, this is a desperate situation. And the father, his name was Martin, he had disappeared in Reynosa, the city across the border from us in McAllen. It is very violent. It is very dangerous. It is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. And he had disappeared. And his wife, who's already in Virginia, waiting her asylum case, wanted help finding him. And so all I knew was that his name was Martin, and he had 2 twin sons, and they were 14. So I went to the bus station. I asked around, looked for twins, couldn't find them. Started talking to teenagers. Well, teenagers talk to teenagers. They sent me to another refuge center. I went there. I just started asking as loud as I could about this man, Martin, and his sons. And then I see 2 boys who are wearing matching jackets. They're 14 years old, they're twins, and they're wearing matching clothes. And I invited them to our house. And it was the day after Halloween, and we had all this Halloween candy, and those kids just sat and ate Halloween candy and just thought, like, what is this place? What is this America? What is this Halloween candy?
Yeah.
And it just made these issues that I had been reading about, even though I had been, doing all of these interviews, like having this family in my home, spending the night in our living room, talking to them as guests, not necessarily as, subjects of an interview. It was just this profound experience. And I've stayed in touch with them, and they're well. They're pursuing their case. These cases take such a long time.
Yeah.
But it has some of the most memorable and some of the most profound moments have been when I've been able to have that personal connection with some of the migrants.
Yeah. Now, to wrap up, tell us what's happening with the cases now, because we're reading about the changes because of all the attention focused on this. There's so much pressure on our government to do something. And the latest that I'm reading is they want to hold them in Mexico and have them be processed in Mexico. What's that all about? How's that working out?
So that was announced in December. And of course, everyone in the border area was alarmed when we heard this. I mean, it would be tremendously dangerous if that were the policy that were ultimately pursued. I mean, I have heard so many stories just in my summer and fall now of reporting of people who have been kidnapped in Reynosa, kidnapped from the bridge, kidnapped from the shelters in Reynosa, kidnapped for ransom. I've heard stories of people who were returned. This is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. It's right across the border from us. It's where people would be waiting. They have no capacity to handle migrants. Right now, migrants who are there awaiting processing are camped out at the base of the bridge under tarps that volunteers have set up. There is no capacity. So we were very alarmed. And at the time that Nielsen, Kristen Nielsen, the DHS secretary, announced the policy, she said it was effective immediately. Well, like many things in the Trump administration, what they say and what happens don't go together. We have no idea what's happening because we have seen no change. In fact, more migrants are being dropped off at the refuge centers here in McAllen, at the refuge centers in San Antonio. I just talked with a friend of mine who runs a refugee center in San Antonio. He told me that there are more people coming now than ever before. So obviously that policy has not been implemented yet. Mexico, I think, is rethinking their support for the policy. There was a tremendous backlash within Mexico. So it remains to be seen what is going to happen with that. But I can tell you, it is a very, very bad idea.
Now, what can people who are watching do? I mean, as far as putting pressure on their elected officials, what is the one thing that we should be asking for right now?
That's a great question. I think we need to, first of all, oppose any efforts to make Mexico a safe third country. It is not a safe third country, especially on the border. We absolutely must allow those who have faced persecution due to domestic violence and due to gang violence in Central America to at least be given an opportunity to appeal for asylum. Because right now, that is one of the big issues, is that Attorney General Sessions and now Acting Attorney General Whitaker have been trying to say that domestic violence and gang violence are not grounds for, first of all, winning your credible fear interview, which is the first step, and then ultimately winning your asylum cases. We have seen the success rate of asylum applications drop dramatically as a result of some of those actions. That's a big problem because people who have very good cases, who would have won previously without question, are now losing their cases and are being deported with their children. And we're going to see more and more cases, if that doesn't change, where those parents are going to be killed when they return, right? And we've already seen some of those cases.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to follow up with Jeff Berkeley and find out what he's working on, and then maybe announce to my viewers in a future show or put it in the comments here what we ought to be pressuring, because it's really going to take a lot, especially when we still have Trump as president and his horrible people in control of all these agencies and the Republican Senate. Before I let you go, I want you to tell people how they can support your book, because this book is not fully funded yet. You're actually fundraising. So,
So the book is being published by Strong Arm Press, which is a small press that was started by an editor at The Intercept. My editor is Laura Moser, who ran for Congress in Houston, has been very involved in border issues and progressive issues more generally. They are actively fundraising to finish the book. We're in the final stages of actually completing the book. I just received my last round of edits this week, so hopefully that's going to be done in the next week or so. There is a website at the Action Network. It's actionnetwork.org. And you can look for Strong Arm Press. That's the name of the press that's putting the book out, and support the book. You can also sign up for an email list to buy the book once it's published. There's a lot of things that people can do, even if they don't live in the border region. The Angry Tias and Abuelas of the Rio Grande Valley have a Facebook page. They have an awesome Amazon wish list they put together for the holidays that has a list of all of the items that they need to continue their work at the bridges and the bus stations and the detention centers. There's a huge need. So that's a great place to start. The ACLU of Texas has been really active. If people want to come volunteer for a week or two, they have some really amazing volunteer opportunities. They have this program called the Ports of Entry Monitors, where people actually go to the bridges and make sure that things are being done correctly, which actually helps speed the process for refugees considerably, having somebody there taking note of what is happening. They have a courtroom monitoring program where ordinary people get just a quick training and go to the courtroom. Migrants are receiving their rights that they are due in the courts in our communities. So that's awesome. Lastly, I'd mention this, the Migrant Center for Human Rights, who is the organization that I travel with, the detention center. They have many volunteer opportunities. One thing that anybody can do is they can become a pen pal to a mom or a dad who is in detention. You know, it's a horribly lonely experience to be in detention. And you can feel like you are all alone and that nobody cares about you in our country. And just having someone to either write with or to converse with over the phone can mean so much. And so that's another opportunity that anybody can do wherever they are in the country.
Can people visit them? I mean, at least in prison, you know, you can visit prisoners. Can you visit people at these centers or no?
It's a little complicated. You have to have what's called a number, which is like an identification number. And coming by those can be a little difficult. But there are groups like the Angry Tias and Abuelas who work with local immigration attorneys who then pass them the A numbers, and then they do visit them. And that can be a really powerful experience for both the volunteers and the moms and dads themselves.
Great. And hopefully we'll get some people helping out here. So it was really wonderful to have you on. You're doing great work there. I look forward to reading the book when it's finished. And maybe if there's more news on this subject down the road, you'll come on again.
I'd love to. Thanks so much for having me, Lauren.
Tuesday, I'm going to be doing my show with Daniel Cohen, who wrote a great article for the Gray Zone Project about this outfit that I got suspicious about when I started hearing this woman, Renee DiResta, on NPR. It's called New Knowledge, and what they are is a private corporation that that researches Russian disinformation campaigns. I heard her on NPR talking about how Black Lives Matter and all these fracking activists and all these posts on Facebook are being put out by the Russians, and I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, I read those posts. They're not Russians. I'm sharing those posts. I'm not Russian. You know, it just seemed a little fishy to me. So I looked them up. And what they do is they sell their services to private corporations that may have, you know, a bad reputation. Either the company itself has a bad reputation or the CEO has gotten in trouble. And what they tell you is, and to get your business, is they're going to blame it on Russia. So this is what they're doing. And so this other stuff that they're doing for testifying in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee is all BS. It's all just to give them cover to make it look like they're actually researching this. But meanwhile, they're disseminating this information. And they were just caught for running their own disinformation campaign in the Doug Jones, Roy Moore campaign in Alabama. And Dan Cohn's going to be talking all about that on Tuesday. On Wednesday, I'm going to have Evan Greer on from Fight for the Future, who's going to talk about the latest status of net neutrality and what we can do now that it was repealed by the Trump administration. Different organizations like Free Press are suing in court to prevent that from going into effect. And also Fight for the Future is looking at Facebook surveillance and invasion of our privacy and how they've actually been sharing our private messages with third parties. Like, you think going into Facebook jail is the worst thing that can happen to you. It happens to me all the time. But believe me, that's not the worst thing that's going on. Then Sunday, I'm going to be interviewing Jill Stein, who ran for president on the Green Party ticket. And then the following Wednesday, the 16th, I'm going to be interviewing Varshini Prakash, who is the founder of the Sunrise Movement. And the Sunrise Movement is making a lot of noise right now. I've covered two of their actions, protests at Ted Lieu's office and protests at Jimmy Gomez's office, to get them both to sign the Green New Deal. And then on Tuesday, I was asked to come back on Aggressive Progressives on TYT. The first half hour is free on Facebook, but then I think it goes behind a paywall, so you have to be a TYT subscriber to see it. So I'm kind of excited about that. And then I'm planning other shows for the rest of the month. So until you see me next, which is going to be on Tuesday, keep fighting.